Welcome to the Azure Stack 101 webinar. This is Kyle Todd from HPE. I'm the category leader for Azure Stack in North America, and I'm joined today by Matt McSpirit from Microsoft. If you're not familiar with the title Black Belt, it basically means you're incredibly smart and knowledgeable. So we're really fortunate to have Matt with us today. I'll start off with a little basic housekeeping. Everything's being recorded, so you'll be able to view this at a later date. If you want, submit questions via the chat tool. We'll either answer them during the webinar or at the very end, and a copy of the presentation will be available for download. So as you can see, we're going to cover a lot of ground today, and we're targeting around 45 minutes, including live demos. So I think that's where the black belt nerves of steel comes into play, because Matt is going to be doing live demos from his laptop via the internet with roughly 800 people watching. So if you took the time to join us for this webinar, you're probably already aware at how incredibly successful Azure is. Azure is growing faster than any dominant cloud platform in the industry today, and I don't think there's any doubt that Azure will be the dominant cloud platform. And since HPE is the #1 platform for Microsoft solutions, we have a vested interest in helping our customers take advantage of the Azure cloud. And clearly that is what's happening. Microsoft adds 120,000 new Azure subscriptions every month, which is just mind-boggling. We're seeing a massive migration from legacy app deployments to applications that are cloud-enabled. But the one stumbling block is that certain applications are better suited to remain on-prem versus being in a public cloud. And that's where Azure Stack comes in. Azure Stack makes it possible to bring select Azure services into your data center. It's the hybrid capability of Azure that aligns perfectly with HPE's vision of the future, because a large percentage of applications will be deployed in a public cloud, but we're going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about those workloads that, for one reason or another, can't go to a public cloud, and how Azure Stack can address those needs in your own data center. And these workloads fall into 4 basic general use cases. The first deals with confidentiality. Most companies have specific data that simply can't be stored in a public cloud. And sometimes that's because of their own internal guidelines. Frequently, it's the result of regulations that you see in a number of industries, and many governmental agencies have similar guidelines. These customers would love to take advantage of cloud services, but for them, the public cloud just isn't an option. The second is performance. That's another use case, and it actually underpins some of the other use cases as well. If you're analyzing large data sets, it may take too long to upload those large data sets to a public cloud, and any cloud that's public is going to introduce some latency into the mix, and that can create performance issues. So if you're chewing through huge amounts of data, that network latency is an issue. In these cases, Azure Stack is an ideal solution because you can access that data in your own data center with virtually no latency. Edge and disconnected applications is the next example. So you might have an environment like a factory floor that isn't connected 24/7 to a public cloud. Or you might have systems that need to periodically go offline. That's a perfect situation where Azure Services on-prem is the best solution. And the last category is simply modern application development. Most companies are in the process of migrating legacy applications to cloud-enabled platforms, or they're developing new cloud-based apps. With Azure Stack, you can develop these applications on-prem, and when you're ready, migrate them to the public cloud without having to change a single line of code. That's the power of Azure, this ability to write an application once and then have the flexibility to take advantage of Azure services in a public cloud or in your own data center. This capability is one of the major things that sets Azure apart from other cloud platforms. And that's why we've invited Matt to join us. So Matt, let me turn things over to you and ask you to help us understand what differentiates Azure from other offerings.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kyle. Thanks for the kind introduction and kind words. So when we think about Azure and Azure Stack, what truly differentiates Azure and Azure Stack and this consistent hybrid cloud is just that, it's consistency across the board, not just around development and DevOps, as we'll see on the right-hand side, but if we look at some of the other pillars First, many of you, I'm sure, will be using Active Directory, either on-prem or you've already started to look at Azure Active Directory as a public cloud identity solution. But that common identity that spans on-prem and public cloud is, again, something that's unique to Microsoft, powered by Azure and Active Directory. Then we think about management. How do you manage efficiently your resources that are running in your data center, either on a traditional physical environment, a virtualization platform, or some other on-prem infrastructure, alongside what's in the public cloud, whether it's in Azure or an alternative? Well, Microsoft's integrated management solutions in Azure enable you to do just that. And that extends into Azure Stack as we go forward as well. When we think about SQL Server and the data platform, being able to be flexible enough to not only back up SQL Server into the cloud and restore into Azure if needed, but also just if you want just to be able to migrate workloads to the cloud, being able to pick up a SQL Server database and move it into Azure without modification and run it on a SQL Server platform in Azure is a fantastic win for IT and a development platform. So providing a consistent data platform is, again, something that's unique to Microsoft and Azure and Azure Stack. And then finally, on the right-hand side, where we're most specifically focused on Azure Stack, is bringing this unified development and platform to run and build and deploy your next generation of cloud applications, no matter where they are. So Azure obviously has hyperscale reach today, infinite scale for you to deploy your applications and workloads, but there are some use cases, as Kyle touched on, that it doesn't make sense for every workload. But bringing those select Azure services, which we'll explore a bit later on, into your environment to run on Azure Stack in a consistent manner means you can still build once and run anywhere, whether that be test and dev and QA on-prem and push into the public cloud for production, or whether it's a hybrid approach where pieces of the application run in different places depending on your sovereignty needs, for instance. Whichever way you look at it, Azure Stack has got you covered alongside these other commonalities across Azure and Azure Stack, and that's what makes the Microsoft proposition really powerful. When we look at the Azure Stack side of things in a little bit more depth, so dive one level deeper, on the right-hand side, we've got these boxes that represent Azure. So when we scale in an Azure data center in the public cloud, we're scaling by the thousands of servers to grow our regions and grow our footprint to provide services to you. And on that platform, we deliver infrastructure, IaaS and PaaS services, and a variety of other services, from machine learning to cognitive services to AI to a whole host of other stuff around IoT, and many, many services that are now available and will be coming available going forward in Azure. And all of that is managed and controlled by what we call Azure Resource Manager. Azure Resource Manager being this management plane that you interact with, the plumbing through either the portal, through PowerShell, or your familiar development tools like Visual Studio, or third-party tools like Jenkins or Chef or Puppet or whatever it may be. There's a whole host of tools and a big ecosystem around integrating with Azure. So you work through Azure Resource Manager to pull the strings on what you want to do from a plumbing perspective under the covers. On the left-hand side, you'll notice a lot of consistency there. We partner with a great partner in HPE to deliver the integrated system hardware. So that's an important note. Azure Stack is an integrated system. It's not a download some software and put it on the hardware yourself. It comes as a prepackaged integrated system. And on there, we provide, as Kyle noted before, a select set of Azure services for you to run within your data center. So compute, network storage, a number of PaaS services as well, which we'll explore in more depth as we go forward. But here's where it really starts to focus in on the consistency. That's that same Azure Resource Manager I just touched on, meaning that it's the same portal, the same PowerShell tooling, the same DevOps or development tools that you're used to using with Azure work with Azure Stack, which means as a developer, I'm used to building once now, and I now have two targets for deployment. Do I want to deploy that workload on-prem on Azure Stack, or do I want to deploy it in the cloud in Azure? I've got that flexibility without needing to rebuild my application. So it is that consistency that we bring to the fore with Azure and Azure Stack. So if we explore that in a little bit more depth, I've got a live demo, as Kyle mentioned before, so hopefully this comes through. What we've got here on my screen at the moment is Azure. How do we know? Because it has Azure in the top left here. And I'm going to walk you through, if you've not utilized Azure before for anything, I'm going to very quickly deploy an Ubuntu virtual machine. So Ubuntu 16.04. I'm just going to go through some of the wizard to create that particular virtual machine, just to give you the experience of what it would be like to walk through from a portal perspective deploying a VM. So we'll give it a name. So Matt Test VM, we'll give it a username, got to give some credentials. This is where my talking and typing come into question here. Oh, my password match, that's a good thing. So put these resources in a resource group. That just is a logical container to contain all of my related resources that get deployed as part of a VM deployment. Then we have this t-shirt size approach to deploying workloads. Now, if you're not familiar with cloud platforms in general, you may be used to doing things in virtualization environments where you very granularly set number of CPUs, memory, disk, and so on. Well, Azure, just like many public cloud offerings, takes more of a t-shirt size approach where a number of the characteristics are defined and grouped under a certain name. So in this case, I'm just going to go with a D2 size virtual machine. That's going to provide what I need. I can finally set some additional options around networking and some storage specifics, but for the most part, I'm happy with those. And within a few clicks, that'll be validated and that information will pop up in this window. But you'll notice at the bottom here as well, I can download the template that's generated in the background associated with everything I've just put in the UI there. So I could reuse that information if I wanted to, which is very useful for repeated standardized deployments. Now that should take a second or two to load, but let me go over to the Azure Stack environment. Looks pretty similar, I think you'll agree. And what you'll see here, how do we know? Because it says Azure Stack in the top left. So we're working in the Azure Stack user portal here. So this is running in my data center, running on my hardware. In this case, I'm going to go New. I'm going to go to Compute again. And the list of options I can deploy, the list of services, is smaller than it is in Azure. Not every Azure service is going to come to Azure Stack. And that's an important point to note. There are some services that are just too big today to fit on an Azure Stack. So we need to make sure that we're bringing the right set of services to Azure Stack in the right manner at the right size and scale. But I'm going to choose my Ubuntu virtual machine, exactly the same. And what you'll see, my process on Azure Stack should look already pretty familiar. So let's just give this one a name, Matt Ubuntu VM. Now there may be some subtle differences, but for the most part, it's very, very consistent. So we'll give it a password. Oh, there you go. So password checking. Let's type this one in again. There we go, they match. We'll use an existing resource group. So I've defined one in Azure Stack, and when we're going to put this in my local data center. So my location here is something I define. It could be my data center, it could be a geographic region, whatever you'd like it to be. Whereas with Azure, I'm choosing from regions all over the world. And just like that, I can start to proceed through the same wizard, the same experience. I'll just go with this particular one for the sake of time. Same kind of settings associated with network and storage. And just like that, I'm at the stage now where it's past validation. I could click OK, and that workload would go and deploy. So what we've seen there very quickly is an example of that consistency from a graphical perspective. But should I be working through the portal? Should I be working programmatically through the APIs or through my development tools? That's the beauty of Azure and Azure Stack, is that consistency across the board. So I mentioned before that Azure Stack is an integrated system. It's not software you download and you run on either an existing piece or a new piece of hardware. It comes as an integrated system. So what does that really look like? Well, when we start to explore that in a more of a graphical sense, it's a rack or a scale unit, as we term it. That's the unit of purchase, a scale unit that consists of redundant power. And working from the top down, management switch, production switches, of which they're redundant, an infrastructure management server, which we actually term the hardware lifecycle host as well, which is used as part of the deployment of the Azure Stack environment, but also used with things like updating and firmware management, and also management tools associated with the hardware, so things like OneView. And then you've got your compute nodes. And a scale unit can ship with a minimum of 4 hyperconverged compute nodes, up to a maximum of 12 today and soon to be 16. And you'll note there that I said hyperconverged compute nodes. These compute nodes have a raft of SSD and spinning disk storage within them that are aggregated into a big pool of storage and then sliced and diced appropriately for the respective workloads using our Storage Spaces Direct technology. So this is a hyperconverged compute node, doesn't use SAN storage, but it's all built into the individual nodes and spread across the pool. So a really powerful, really scalable, high performance system contained within that scale unit. So I wanted to give you a quick sense of not only what's the hybrid experience and the consistency, but just what it looks briefly like to run an Azure Stack, because that's an important part to be aware of. When you're embracing Azure Stack, or more specifically, when you embrace Azure, you're a user of Azure. You consume Azure, and Microsoft is behind the scenes running the Azure infrastructure. Now, when Azure Stack is residing within your data center, within your on-prem environment, there needs to be an administrative operator that's operating that cloud for your users. And that's where the Azure Stack administration dashboard, as you can see on the screen here, comes into play. The Azure Stack administration dashboard is specifically for the cloud operator to operate your Azure Stack within your environment. And there's some specific metrics and tasks and functionality that is unique to the Azure Stack administration experience, rather than the portal, the user portal that we saw earlier on. So you'll see, just glancing at this administration dashboard, we have functionality associated with patching and updating. Very important to maintain consistency of your Azure Stack environment. You'll see we have alerting functionality here as well. So something to be aware of when you're collecting alerts about and metrics and logs about the infrastructure. You'll notice we've got capacity issue here, critical. So if I delve into that particular alert, you'll see I get more information about my storage and usage, but I can delve into specific alerts associated with perhaps a role within the environment that's unhealthy. And drilling into that still further, I can look at the metrics and associated information and what I should need to do here. So that's experiencing an issue. In this case, I should contact support, either raising a ticket through the Azure portal or contacting HPE or Microsoft support through your usual channels that you prefer. Going back to the administration dashboard, as we see, we've also got capacity information and specific functionality on the left-hand side associated with what we call plans and offers. These are associated with how we make Azure Stack services available to our end users. So if I'd like my users to be able to consume virtual machines, I define that in a plan, I'd expose that to my users through an offer, and they would be able to subscribe to that to be able to utilize those particular services within the Azure Stack. And the final area I'll touch on a bit later on is this marketplace management. So how I can bring additional third-party and first-party Microsoft services to my users in a streamlined, syndicated way. But we'll explore that in a bit more depth later on. But from an administrative perspective, that's where you would spend your time in this administration portal as the cloud operator, really controlling who can see what, who can access what piece of information and functionality from a user perspective. So moving on, we've talked about the integrated system. We've talked about some of the hybrid capabilities. I've touched on very briefly some of the services, but I want to really hammer that home in terms of what is on Stack today and what's coming in the future. Now, if we look at that bottom row of services that are available, virtual machines, you saw me dive through that in the first demo where I walked through the virtual machine deployment. So great platform for deploying Windows and Linux virtual machines. Inside virtual machines, obviously running Docker containers if you'd like to go down that road to modernize some of your applications. And then naturally, both of those capabilities require networking and storage. And if you want to store any secrets and provide access to applications to those secrets, that's where Key Vault provides significant value as well. But then that top row of services is really where we start to look at PaaS and platform as a service if you're not familiar. So the app service, being able to deploy web apps, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Being able to embrace serverless computing, so Azure Functions, really focusing on your developers just executing their code, just specific chunks of code that might execute on a trigger or a schedule, just to provide some very specific application functionality. And then we look at microservices and how Service Fabric helps you to componentize your applications down to the service level and run those in a scalable and automated and very streamlined fashion. And then we start to think about how we integrate with our partnerships and community-driven experiences with the likes of Kubernetes and also Cloud Foundry as platforms for modern applications as well. And those ones are coming soon to the Azure Stack platform, along with Service Fabric. Now, one that's missing off there is around SQL and MySQL. Unfortunately, we've got SQL and MySQL resource providers available for Azure Stack, so they can be easily installed and added to enable you to provision databases as a service for your users, again, which is a powerful developer-focused functionality. Now, I mentioned before the marketplace. There is a huge Azure ecosystem out there, thousands of applications and solutions that can be quickly deployed on Azure to enable you to deploy a pre-configured Chef or Puppet or Kemp or Red Hat infrastructure, whatever it may be, on Azure. Now, we're working with many of these ISVs and software vendors to bring their solutions to Azure Stack as well, which means that you'll be able to provide those pre-packaged solutions to your users within your data center, within the Azure Stack Marketplace. So to give you a quick idea of what that looks like, let's firstly pop back to my demo environment, and I'm going to go over to, again, we're in the administration portal, and I'm going to click on Marketplace Management. And what you'll see in my Marketplace view is I have this option here that lists Add from Azure. And Add from Azure is basically saying, okay, show me the list of syndicatable, so syndicated offerings that have been validated from Azure to work on Azure Stack. And you'll see the list of various virtual machine and software-based solutions from both Microsoft and our partners and ISVs out there. So Bitnami have done a significant amount of work to bring a variety of different services within virtual machines to Azure Stack. They've obviously been very busy. There's a variety of other offerings as well out there that you can use, and more are coming all of the time. And to simply add them to my environment, I'll click on one. So let's choose this PHP list one at random. I'll click download, and within a few minutes, depending on the size of the image, this one's about 30 gigabytes in size, within a few minutes, it will appear in my list of items that have already been downloaded. And I can now make these available to my users to consume. So it saves me building a custom solution if it already exists in the marketplace. Now, it's important to note that I can actually still sideload custom solutions into this environment if I want to as well. So if I've got a line of business app that runs on a bespoke distribution of Linux, and I want to package that up, we've got great documentation that walks you through how to do that and enabling you to sideload into the marketplace so that your users can consume them through the user portal. Now, speaking of the user portal, let's go back there and let's quickly walk through a simple PaaS deployment. So I'm going to use a simple web app. So let's put myself in the shoes of I'm a web developer. I don't want to concern myself with building a virtual machine to then go into that virtual machine to maintain it and patch it and install the necessary web-based functionality that I need to run my app. I just want to build my web app. So I'm going to go to New and Marketplace and choose Web and Mobile. I'm going to choose Web App. And all I need to do for this particular piece of functionality is provide some very basic information. And I could do this programmatically as well, but I'll call this MattDev001. That's going to be the catchy name of my website. And you'll see it's going to be given a particular domain name that would match my the way my Azure Stack has been deployed. So it could be .appservice.contoso.com if you were deploying this in a custom environment. But you can also change those domain names later once the app has been deployed. So I've got a few more settings to select, and just like that, I'll click Create. And within a few seconds, what's happening in the background now is the portal is communicating with the relevant resource providers through the Azure Resource Manager. It's pulling the strings on the necessary components under the covers, and just like that, my web app has been deployed successfully. So clicking into that, it should give me the URL here. And I'll click on that and load it in my browser, and there you go. So within a few seconds, I've deployed a web app, so I'm embracing PaaS services. Now, this isn't a particularly exciting web app. It doesn't do a great deal. There's nothing here yet, but the app service makes it simple to publish with Git, FTP, or whatever your favorite development tools are. So what we've seen there very briefly is a quick look at how I deployed a PaaS service, and it would be exactly the same as if I was doing it in Azure, and we've had a look around the marketplace to understand what value that provides us. So hopefully that was useful. So to recap Azure Stack, it's important to understand what it is and what it isn't. Now, as we've explained, it's a hybrid cloud platform. It's got a lot of consistency with Azure across those services that are available within Azure and Azure Stack, and enabling you to really embrace a truly consistent hybrid platform. But it's not designed as just a virtualization replacement play. Yes, you can absolutely use it for running virtual machines and workloads and really standardize and automate a lot of that deployment. But there's so much more in Azure Stack, as we saw from that slide that showcased the variety of services that are available, especially the PaaS services. Embracing PaaS services is really how you start to modernize your infrastructure and your applications and workloads for the future. Then when we think about the integrated system, that's exactly what it is. It's a software and hardware validated, tested, configured solution that is implemented into your data center, and Kyle will talk a bit more about that as we go forward. It isn't something you download and install for a production workload on existing hardware. It's not DIY infrastructure. And in the same breath, it needs to be kept up to date. That's why we built a very specific patch and update process integrated with Azure Stack to enable you to maintain consistency with Azure and obviously keep up to date with security patches and fixes and other critical updates. So another important part, this isn't a static system that you just deploy once or is deployed within your data center and then left. It's important to keep it up to date and managed from that perspective. And then finally, I didn't deploy any Windows workloads really, and certainly from not a VM perspective, which just shows that Azure and Azure Stack are really open and flexible. Whether you want to use Linux-based workloads on the platform, whether you want to manage and integrate with open source tooling that you may already be using, or Visual Studio or Windows workloads, it's a great solution for all of those. It's not just about running .NET and Windows-based workloads on the platform. So before we get into some more of the specifics around the HPE examples and information, I want to finally reiterate, based on now what we know about Azure Stack, how some of this applies to those use cases that Kyle talked about earlier on. And I'm going to focus in on three with the performance use case really ingrained in all of these. So the first one is around sovereignty and compliance and regulatory. Imagine I've got an application that I'd like to deploy globally across all of my locations around the globe. But in certain countries, there isn't an Azure data center. And my compliancy requirements are that the data must reside within the geography that my data center is or where I operate. So from that perspective, having an Azure Stack located within that particular geography without needing to change my application now enables me to deploy a version or an instance of my application in that particular Azure Stack location to meet my regulatory needs. The same in country 3, but in the rest of my geographies where perhaps the regulations aren't as stringent or I'm able to use the Azure data center that's either in my geography or nearby, I can deploy that same application into Azure. So that's the beauty of how this model, this hybrid approach is no changes to my apps, build once and run anywhere to meet my regulatory needs. Now that second use case is around the application model and embracing those new modern architectures such as PaaS, serverless computing, microservices, containers, moving to those to really modernize my applications. But the beauty of the Azure and Azure Stack offering here is it's a consistent approach across cloud and on-prem. So I'm able to move to Azure in the future with no code changes or maintain this hybrid approach where some pieces of my application reside in Azure, some in Azure Stack, or I use dev test QA on-prem and production in Azure. You've got the flexibility to decide, but working through a modernization process to really transform your existing legacy applications into these new modern architectures can really pay dividends for your applications and workloads going forward. And then finally, as Kyle touched on with the factory example, latency requirements, connectivity issues, the need for local data processing of large amounts of data, Azure Stack's a great solution for that to reside within your data center, to handle some of that huge amounts of number crunching and data processing on-prem before potentially sending the refined cleansed data up to Azure for long-term archival storage or further modeling or aggregated analysis, or utilizing some of the Azure services on that data that don't exist in Azure Stack, like some of the cognitive services or machine learning. The key thing here again is that common application logic, whether it's across Azure Stack, Azure, or both, and whether it's connected or disconnected. You've really got the flexibility to embrace there. So, Kyle, why don't you? I'll hand back to you, and why don't you take us through some of the differentials that HPE provides in this space?
Okay, super. Thank you, Matt. So Azure Stack does run on several different vendor platforms, but not all stacks are equal. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what differentiates HPE for Azure Stack. And the first is the thorough job that we do integrating the hardware and the software at the factory and then bringing people on site to deploy this for you. So we don't drop this at a loading dock and pass you the car keys and say, have fun with this. We definitely have our professional services organization to do the install. But even more than that, there's a complete portfolio of services provided by either HPE or our partners or a combination thereof to help you through the whole process of deploying Azure Stack solutions. And it actually starts long before the installation. We typically begin with workshops to look at the fundamental question of coming up with a priority of which applications should be migrated to a cloud platform, and then figure out which of those applications should be deployed on-prem or in a public cloud. And after that plan is put together, then HPE and our partners can support our customers from designing applications to migrating data to managing the whole environment. Now, some other system vendors have a limited number of offerings, and that's one approach, and it makes the whole ordering process quite easy. But we understand that every application is going to have different performance characteristics and different requirements. And so that's a huge part of our strategy, is to make sure that we design exactly the right CPU type and the number of CPUs so that we're providing optimal performance. The next thing is the management of the system. One of the things that customers love about the cloud experience is that it's just so easy to manage. And if you deploy Azure Stack, you don't want to take a step backwards and go back to, disparate tools that don't integrate very well and trying to figure out how to make them all work together. So OneView from HPE addresses that with a really simple pane of glass, so we can emulate that easy cloud management experience. And then the last thing is GreenLake flexible capacity pricing. And this is one of the biggest differentiators, because as people move to the cloud, they grow accustomed to and they depend on the idea that they don't pay up front, they pay for what they actually use. So they've got the ability to scale if usage goes up, but if their usage tails off or there's periods where it's more dormant, they're not paying for a large charge. And for those customers who like that business model, we're able to replicate that with GreenLake flexible capacity so that you actually pay for what you're using on a monthly basis. We monitor the usage, and if the usage goes down, then that monthly bill goes down. And if the usage goes up, then the price or the total cost goes up. But one of the nice details is that the more you're using, the lower the price is for the compute unit. So you win both ways. As the usage goes up, we're going to give you a lesser price per compute unit. And if your usage goes down, that's going to be reflected in a lower bill. And the reason this is so important is what we see from the IDC figures is that everybody is moving towards a model where IT is consumed on a consumption basis. So it just makes sense that our offering is available on a consumption-based price model. And there are many customers who still prefer to acquire the hardware outright, and we're very happy to do that. But for people that have moved towards a consumption-based model, we can accommodate it with GreenLake flexible capacity. And here's just a slide that shows some of those details about the fact that the usage goes down. Another advantage that we've got is the Innovation Center. So at the Microsoft Innovation Center in Redmond, Washington, and there's also one in Geneva, Switzerland, if you want to plan a family vacation around a visit to Microsoft, you can do a number of things. You can see in-depth demos, you can get detailed technical overviews. Two of the biggest and most compelling activities, though, are the business planning workshop and the POC. So the benefit of a business planning workshop is that you're able to monetize the value of Azure Stack and come up with success metrics and figure out how to manage an entire project so that you can build a use case or a business case that warrants going forward and shows you when you're succeeding. And the other thing is POCs. We will do proof of concepts staffed by Microsoft and HPE folks at no cost to customers. So it's a great resource to take advantage of. So number of steps or suggestions as far as getting started. You can download the Azure Stack Development Kit for free. And if you've got a DL380 somewhere in your data center, that's what it runs on. Please invite you to visit the website that you see here for lots more details so you can learn more about Azure Stack. We'd ask you to follow us on Twitter and keep track of what's coming out, what's new. Matt alluded towards things like we're at 12 compute nodes now, we're going to go to 16. So things like advances with functionality and capabilities, if you're following us on Twitter, you'll be clued into those. You can schedule a hybrid cloud strategy session. And the last thing is, again, visit the Innovation Center. It's a great way to expedite the whole evaluation process of Azure Stack to figure out what the value is that goes into your business. So that is all of the prepared slides. What we're going to do now is toggle over to some Q&A, and we got some early questions that I'm going to read. Not surprisingly, most of them go to Matt. So Matt, I'm going to read these off to you, all right?
Just only the easy ones, please.
Okay, great. So the first question is Azure and Azure Stack the best solution any customer could hope for? You wanted to...
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, well, I'm gonna have to dial it up a little bit from there. Okay, how do you license Azure Stack software? How do I know how many licenses to buy?
Good question. Right. Okay. So when it comes to licensing, there are two distinct stages, let's say, from a purchase of Azure Stack. The first is around your engagement with HPE to purchase the integrated system itself, the hardware. And as Kyle rightly outlined, there's lots of flexibility around things like CPU, memory sizing, storage, and so on to right size the integrated system for your needs within your scale unit. From there, once you've had the implementation has taken place, it's been deployed in your environment, you have the Azure services running. Just like Azure Stack is licensed on a consumption model primarily, which basically means that as you start to spin up workloads and spin up meters for things like virtual machines or PaaS services, there's a per CPU or a per gigabyte charge associated with that. Now, the corresponding price of a VM in running on Azure Stack versus the same size and shape virtual machine running in Azure, it's significantly less on Azure Stack because you've made that investment in the hardware, you're powering it, you're cooling it, you're managing it, and all of the associated costs for running infrastructure. So the cost of running a VM in Azure Stack is significantly cheaper than running it in Azure. And the same applies to things like PaaS services and whatnot. But that's the fundamental idea or way you would purchase and license Azure Stack. You don't buy, I want X number of Azure Stacks. You purchase based on the consumption approach within the integrated system. Now, there is one alternative approach to licensing the Azure Stack services, and that is what we call a capacity model. The capacity model we primarily see used in environments that are disconnected, that can't report their billing and their metric information to Azure. And that's an important clarification point for the consumption model. It needs to be connected to Azure in order to send that billing information, and it all comes towards your single Azure bill. Now, going back to that capacity model, that's an annual fee, and the fee is different based on whether you just want to do virtual machines or whether you want to do VM and PaaS services. And like I say, it's an annual fee. It's available for the disconnected scenarios. You can use it in connected scenarios as well, but we see it more likely used in the disconnected scenarios. So they're the two models, consumption and capacity. The capacity model is an all-you-can-eat model as well. So it's the same price whether you spin up 10 VMs or 500 VMs or 20 PaaS services or 1,000 PaaS services. It doesn't change. As I said, it's an annual fee. So in the scenario like the edge and disconnected scenario where there's no connectivity back, maybe it's an air-gapped environment, that's where the capacity model would fit best. Whereas in the main data center where there's connectivity to Azure, the consumption model and pay-as-you-use would be applicable there. So that's
most customers would work with their Microsoft representatives to figure out what the most cost-effective approach would be, it sounds like.
Sure. Yep.
Okay, great. So the next question actually was asked of me yesterday when I was presenting. So I'm going to listen to your response and see how close I got to an accurate reply. It was, how does the licensing of Azure Stack fit with any licensing I may already have for Azure within my enterprise agreement? And that was the key piece. Customer said, I've got an enterprise agreement. Do I fit Azure Stack into it?
Yeah, if you've already got Azure committed money within your enterprise agreement, then Azure Stack in the consumption model just consumes from that same pot essentially. So you would just see on your Azure bill line items that reflect Azure Stack workloads side by side with line items that reflect your Azure consumption on there as well. So there's integration between the two. From the capacity model, that's available on the enterprise agreement, but that would be a separate from your Azure bill. And it's important to note as well, just as a side point to your question, around other licenses for things that I've got within my environment. So if you've got existing Windows Server licenses or SQL Server licenses, they can be used in conjunction with Azure Stack, just like they can with Azure, to actually reduce the cost of running some of the Windows-based workloads and SQL-based workloads within the environment.
Oh,
so that's an important to note. Yeah, if you've got existing licenses, they can be used with the Azure Stack environment, and we do document all of this on our Azure Stack homepage and the pricing and licensing document.
Perfect. Next, how can I find out if my current Azure applications will be supported in Azure Stack?
Good question. So how can I find my existing Azure apps? So the key thing about existing Azure apps, if they don't have dependencies on services that don't exist in Azure Stack, so for instance, if you had existing web apps or virtual machines, then they'll be fine on Azure Stack. As we alluded to in the slides, there's a select set of Azure services that are available on Stack: virtual machines, web apps, and other PaaS services like functions. So as long as you're adhering to the services that exist within Azure Stack, they are consistent with Azure. So you can bring those applications to Azure Stack and run them locally if you need to. If, for instance, you had an application that was utilizing the cognitive services and IoT, those services don't exist in Azure Stack today, and some may not in the future. We're still working on that engineering process as to which services we bring to Azure Stack in the future, based on customer demand, based on scale and what we can fit on Azure Stack. There's a lot of considerations. But the nice thing about Azure Stack and the way it's built and developed, just like Azure, is we operate in these really short development cycles. The Azure Stack development cycle is around about 6 months, which means that if something isn't there today, but there's a lot of feedback and a lot of engagement between customers who want to see a particular service or a particular functionality on Azure Stack, if it's the right fit and it can be done, we can engineer that relatively quickly versus traditional life cycles of products like Windows Server and System Center of old, where if it missed the cut, it was likely not to get in the product until a couple of years down the line, which doesn't fit with today's modern agile environments that people are looking for. So yeah, bit of a side point on the topic there, but something to be aware of.
So we have time for 2 more questions. The first one's easy. I think it's a 1-syllable reply. Can I combine different vendors' hardware in the same Azure Stack region?
No, is the answer.
That would be
today.
the 1 syllable.
Yes, so within an Azure Stack region, and we didn't go into much depth, I alluded to it in the demo. Within an Azure Stack region, we support today a single scale unit, soon to support multiple scale units within this development cycle. And what that means is you could have a single rack or multiple racks, but they would need to be from the same hardware vendor.
Okay, so as long as people choose HPE, they won't have any problems. You don't have to answer. So last question, VMware recently announced that they were working with AWS to allow customers to run VMware infrastructure within the AWS data centers. What is the difference here? Yeah,
so what's interesting about that approach is it is just running VMware's virtualization platform in a location that's separate from your own data center, which is great. If you've not got another data center, you can run it there, but it's just more virtualization. Azure Stack and Azure would give you that same approach, having virtualization platforms in both places. But Azure and Azure Stack and the Azure services that I've talked about today are so much more than just virtualization, enabling you to deploy very efficient PaaS services and microservices and embrace modern architectures. And the VMware platform just doesn't have that. AWS natively has that, but there's no specific integration with a VMware infrastructure platform, whereas Azure Stack and Azure both share that commonality of those IaaS and PaaS services across both. So that's the key difference in that unique proposition that Microsoft provides. Is it's truly consistent with the services that exist across both.
And to get AWS, yeah, you're obligated to stay in a public cloud environment.
Yeah, naturally.
Okay, so the VMware AWS solution is a small subset of the functionality that you get with Azure and Azure Stack.
Yep, from a hybrid and a consistent perspective, yeah. If you wanted the same services residing in both places, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, great. Hey, we are out of time. We said 45 minutes, and we're going to keep our promise. We have data that you can download from the website. And Matt, I am really impressed that you got through every demo without a hiccup. That was remarkable. So I really want to thank Matt McSpirit for joining us and sharing so much information about Azure Stack with us. It is a really, really exciting offering, and it's core to what HPE is doing with the whole hybrid cloud movement. So I'm grateful for our partnership with Microsoft. Grateful to all of you for joining in. Thanks so much. And forward the URL for the registration to a friend. Let them listen in. I think they'll learn a lot, and hopefully they'll enjoy it as well. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.